Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we start today's case, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to my channel. Your support is very important to me, so please subscribe to follow more cases and encourage us. Click the like button and let's get into the case. The moon hung like a silver dollar in the night sky, casting thin ribbons of light across the dark waters of Emerald Bay. Jake Thornton stood at the edge of the private dock behind his uncle's waterfront property in Pensacola, Florida, his toes curling around the weathered wooden planks. At 34, Jake had spent most of his life around water, growing up in San Diego, then moving to the Gulf Coast after college. But tonight, the bay looked different, mysterious, inviting. It was just past midnight on a sweltering July night, and sleep had eluded him for hours. The air inside the beach house felt stifling, despite the cranked-up air conditioning, and Jake had slipped outside hoping the night breeze might cool his skin. Now, as he gazed at the gentle waves lapping against the shore, the idea of a midnight swim seemed irresistible. He glanced back at the house. His Uncle Mark's warning from earlier that day echoed in his mind. They've had a couple of bull shark sightings this week. County put up advisories at the public beaches. I wouldn't go in deeper than your knees for a while. Jake snorted softly. He'd been swimming with sharks before, intentionally on a guided dive in the Keys years ago. Bull sharks could be aggressive, sure, but attacks were rare. Besides, this was a private stretch of bay, away from the fishing, piers where sharks were more commonly spotted, following the scent of bait and discarded catches. He pulled his t-shirt over his head and tossed it onto a nearby deck chair. The breeze felt good against his bare torso. He was already wearing swim trunks. He'd been lounging around in them all evening, so there was nothing stopping him from sliding into the dark water. Just a quick dip to cool off, then back to bed. Jake walked to the end of the dock, crouching to dip his fingers into the water. It was warmer than he expected, almost like bath water. Perfect. Without hesitation, he dove in, cutting cleanly through the surface with barely a splash. The water enveloped him like silk, instantly soothing the restlessness that had driven him outside. Jake surfaced, shaking water from his hair, and began to swim parallel to the shoreline with long, practiced strokes. He'd been a competitive swimmer in high school and had kept the habit through his adult years, hitting the pool at his apartment complex 3 times a week. The salt water created more resistance than he was used to, but his muscles welcomed the gentle burn. About 50 yards out from the dock, Jake paused, treading water as he caught his breath. The night was so quiet, he could hear the distant hum of a boat engine somewhere far out in the bay. He floated on his back, gazing up at the stars and the 3/4 moon, letting the gentle current rock him. This was exactly what he'd needed: peace, solitude, the soft embrace of the water. He didn't see the shadow moving beneath him, sleek and purposeful. Bull sharks were unique among their kind, capable of regulating the salt content in their bodies to survive in both salt and fresh water. This particular specimen, a female nearly 8 feet long, had been cruising the inlets and bays along the Florida Panhandle for weeks, following the summer runs of mullet and snapper. She'd ventured into Emerald Bay earlier that day, riding the incoming tide in search of food. 300 million years of evolution had perfected her as a predator. Her ampullae of Lorenzini, special sensing organs in her snout, could detect the faintest electrical impulses generated by muscle contractions. Even in the dark water, her keen senses registered the vibrations of something large swimming above her. Jake had just decided to head back to the dock when he felt it, an odd sensation, like the water pressure had suddenly changed. He wasn't sure what made him look down at that exact moment. Some primal instinct, perhaps, a whisper from the deepest recesses of human evolutionary memory. Moonlight penetrated the shallow water, just enough for him to see the massive silhouette gliding beneath him, its movements unhurried but purposeful. For a frozen moment, Jake's brain refused to process what his eyes were seeing. Then training kicked in. Don't panic, don't splash, don't flee like prey. Slowly, trying not to create disturbance in the water, Jake began to swim toward the dock. His heart hammered against his ribs, but he kept his strokes smooth and deliberate. 30 yards to safety. 25. He could see the outline of the dock clearly now, the porch light from the house creating a golden path across the water. The shark made its first pass, a curious investigation, swimming close enough that Jake could see the distinctive blunt snout that gave bull sharks their name. His pulse roared in his ears, but he maintained his steady pace. 20 yards now. He could make it. The second pass came faster. The shark circled back, moving with more purpose, closing the distance. Jake abandoned caution and began to swim. Harder, his arms cutting through the water with desperate strength. 15 yards. 10. The attack came without warning. One moment Jake was swimming, the next he was jerked sideways with such force that he was momentarily disoriented. There was a sickening sensation of pressure around his left calf. Then pain exploded through his leg, so intense that white spots danced before his eyes. Instinct took over. Jake twisted in the water and struck out blindly, his right fist connecting with something solid and sandpaper rough. The shark released its grip momentarily, and Jake used the reprieve to propel himself toward the dock with frantic strokes, his injured leg trailing uselessly behind him. The shark circled back. Jake could sense it more than see it now. The water, churning behind him, 5 yards to the dock. 4. He stretched out his arms, lungs burning, the metallic taste of fear sharp on his tongue. The second bite came at his right thigh. This time Jake screamed, the sound tearing from his throat and echoing across the quiet bay. The shark shook him violently, like a dog with a rag doll. Jake felt tissue tearing, a horrible grinding sensation as teeth scraped against bone. Fighting through the haze of pain, he jabbed his fingers toward what he hoped were the shark's eyes. The pressure released suddenly, and Jake found himself free. Not questioning his luck, he used his arms to drag himself the final distance to the dock, leaving a dark trail in the water behind him. His fingers scrabbled at the wooden ladder, slipping on the slick algae that coated the rungs. With one massive effort, he hauled himself up onto the dock and collapsed, gasping. For several agonizing minutes, Jake lay there, his chest heaving as he fought to stay conscious. Blood pooled beneath him, spreading across the weathered planks, in an expanding circle. The pain was everywhere now, radiating from his mangled leg up through his torso, making it hard to think, to breathe. He needed to get help, needed to stop the bleeding. Jake dragged himself onto his elbows, fighting down a wave of nausea as he got his first clear look at his injuries. His left calf was shredded, deep lacerations exposing muscle and pale glimpses of bone. His right thigh bore a massive crescent of puncture wounds, each the size of a quarter. Blood pulsed from the wounds with each heartbeat. Too much blood. Jake fumbled with shaking hands to untie the drawstring from his swim trunks. Gritting his teeth against the pain, he looped the cord around his left leg above the knee and pulled it as tight as he could, knotting it clumsily. It wasn't a proper tourniquet, but it might slow the bleeding. "Help!" His voice sounded weak, even to his own ears. The beach house was dark and silent, 100 yards up the sloping lawn. His uncle was a sound sleeper, unlikely to hear him from this distance. Jake's phone was inside, charging on the nightstand beside his bed. With no other choice, Jake began the torturous journey up the dock toward the house. Each movement sent fresh waves of agony through his mangled legs, but he forced himself to keep going, dragging himself inch by excruciating inch across the rough wood. By the time he reached the end of the dock, Jake's vision was narrowing. Darkness creeping in from the edges. He was leaving a shocking amount of blood behind him, a glistening trail in the moonlight. The cool night air raised goosebumps on his skin, and he was beginning to shiver uncontrollably, shock setting in. The lawn stretching up to the house might as well have been miles long. Jake tried to call out again, but his voice was barely a croak now. Gathering the last of his strength, he pulled himself forward, fingers digging into the soft grass, the pain receding to a distant throb as his body began to shut down. He made it perhaps 10 yards before consciousness slipped away entirely. Mark Thornton woke abruptly, unsure what had disturbed his sleep. He lay still for a moment, listening. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioner. Then he heard it, a faint sound from outside, something between a cry and a moan. Frowning, Mark swung his legs over the side of the bed, hand padded to the window. The moon was bright enough that he could see most of the yard clearly, down to where the lawn sloped toward the water. Nothing seemed amiss. He was about to turn away when something caught his eye, an unusual shape. On the grass, about halfway between the dock and the house, Mark squinted, his sleep-fogged brain struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. The shape moved slightly, and sudden understanding hit him like a physical blow. "Jake!" He bolted from the bedroom, taking the stairs 2 at a time. He burst through the back door and sprinted across the lawn, his bare feet slipping on the dew-damp grass. As he drew closer, the full horror of the situation became clear. Jake lay motionless, his lower body covered in blood. A trail of it, leading back to the dock. "Oh God, Jake!" Mark dropped to his knees beside his nephew. Jake's skin was ashen in the moonlight, his lips tinged blue. Mark pressed trembling fingers to Jake's neck, relief washing through him when he felt a pulse. Weak, unthready, but there. Mark yanked off his t-shirt and pressed it against the worst of the wounds on Jake's thigh, then fumbled in his pocket for his phone before remembering he'd left it on the bedside table. Unwilling to leave Jake even for the minute it would take to retrieve it, Mark bellowed toward the house, "Diane! Diane!" Lights came on in the master bedroom, and moments later, Mark's wife appeared at the back door, her expression shifting from annoyance to horror as she took in the scene on the lawn. "Call 911!" Mark shouted. "It's Jake. He's been attacked by something." The next hours passed in a blur of sirens, flashing lights, and urgent voices. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their practiced efficiency, a stark contrast to Mark's panicked attempts at first aid. They established IVs, applied proper tourniquets, and loaded Jake onto a stretcher, all the while firing questions that Mark could only partially answer. "Looks like shark bites," one of the EMTs said grimly, as they wheeled Jake toward the waiting ambulance. "Probably a bull. We've had a few in the bay this week. Was he swimming at night?" Mark nodded numbly, watching as they lifted the stretcher into the ambulance. "I warned him. There were advisories." "You riding with him?" the EMT asked, and Mark climbed in without hesitation, his wife promising to follow in their car. As the ambulance doors closed, Mark caught a last glimpse of their yard, now trampled by emergency personnel, the trail of his nephew's blood dark. Against the grass, the ambulance screamed through the quiet streets of Pensacola, carrying them to Baptist Hospital's trauma center. Jake remained unconscious throughout the journey, his vital signs weakening despite the paramedics' efforts to stabilize him. Mark sat helplessly by, holding his nephew's cold hand and praying to a God he hadn't spoken to in years. At the hospital, Jake was whisked away immediately, leaving Mark alone in a sterile waiting room with forms to fill out and Jake's blood drying on his hands. Diane arrived 20 minutes later, bringing clean clothes and coffee that Mark couldn't bring himself to drink. They sat together in silence, the harsh fluorescent lights making the situation seem even more surreal. It was nearly 2 hours before a doctor emerged, still wearing surgical scrubs spotted with blood. Dr. Evelyn Chen was petite, with tired eyes and a direct manner that Mark found oddly comforting. "Mr. Thornton's condition is critical but stable," she said without preamble. "He's lost a significant amount of blood, and the damage to his left leg is extensive. We've managed to repair the femoral artery in his right thigh. That's what saved his life, the fact that it wasn't completely severed." "Will he?" Mark couldn't finish the question. Dr. Chen's expression softened slightly. "He's young and fit, which works in his favor, but I want to be honest with you. His left leg below the knee was severely compromised. The tibial nerve was damaged, and there was significant muscle and tissue loss." She paused. "We're going to do everything we can to save the leg, but you should prepare yourselves for the possibility that amputation may be necessary." Diane let out a small sound, somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Mark put his arm around her shoulders, trying to process the doctor's words. "Can we see him?" he asked. Dr. Chen nodded. "He's in recovery now. We've put him in a medically induced coma to give his body time to stabilize. You can see him briefly, but he won't be conscious." They followed her through a maze of corridors to the ICU. Jake lay surrounded by machines, tubes snaking from his arms, his legs heavily bandaged. His face was the only part of him that looked untouched, peaceful almost, as if he was simply sleeping. "I told him about the sharks," Mark whispered, more to himself than to Diane. "I told him not to go in the water." While Jake fought for his life in the ICU, the bull shark that had attacked him continued its solitary journey through the coastal waters of the Florida Panhandle. The encounter with the human had not been about hunger. She'd fed on a large mullet earlier that day. Rather, it had been a response to the odd vibrations in the water, a territorial reaction to an unknown entity in her hunting ground. Now, with the summer breeding season approaching, she was heading toward the deeper waters of the Gulf of Mexico. The shark bore no marks from the encounter, save for a slight tenderness around her right eye, where Jake's desperate fingers had struck a lucky blow. In her primitive consciousness, the incident was already forgotten, replaced by the more pressing imperatives of survival and reproduction. 3 days after the attack, Jake Thornton opened his eyes. The first thing he became aware of was the pain, a deep, throbbing ache that seemed to radiate from his lower body throughout his entire frame. The second was the rhythmic beeping of machines. Hospital, his foggy brain supplied. I'm in a hospital. Memories came flooding back in jagged fragments. The midnight swim, the massive shadow beneath him, the agonizing pressure of jaws closing around his leg. Jake tried to sit up, panic surging through him, but found himself too weak to lift his head from the pillow. Easy, easy. A nurse appeared at his side, her hand gentle on his shoulder. You're at Baptist Hospital in Pensacola. You're safe. Jake licked dry lips, his voice emerging as a croak. My legs. The doctor will be in to speak with you soon, the nurse said, checking one of the monitors beside his bed. Your uncle and aunt are here. They've barely left since you were brought in. Would you like to see them? Jake nodded, his throat too tight for words. Minutes later, Mark and Diane entered the room, their faces etched with worry and exhaustion. Mark approached the bed cautiously, as if afraid Jake might break. Hey, kiddo, he said, his voice rough with emotion. You gave us one hell of a scare. I'm sorry, Jake whispered. You warned me, the sharks, I should have listened. Don't worry about that now, Diane cut in, squeezing his hand. Just focus on getting better. Jake swallowed hard. My legs, can I? Mark and Diane exchanged a glance that made Jake's stomach drop. Before either could answer, Dr. Chen entered the room, clipboard in hand. Good to see you awake, Mr. Thornton, she said briskly. How's the pain on a scale? Of 1 to 10? 6, 7, Jake tried to assess. What happened to my legs? Dr. Chen moved to the foot of the bed. You sustained severe lacerations to both legs during the shark attack. Your right thigh had multiple deep puncture wounds, including one that nicked your femoral artery, but we were able to repair the damage. With physical therapy, you should regain full function. She paused, and Jake knew the worst was coming. Your left leg below the knee suffered more extensive damage. We've performed 2 surgeries to repair what we could, but there was significant tissue loss and nerve damage. She met his eyes directly. We're going to try one more reconstructive procedure, but I want to be upfront with you. There's a high probability that amputation may be necessary. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He closed his eyes, trying to process what she was saying. His career as an architectural designer didn't strictly require physical mobility, but his life, his identity was so wrapped up in his active lifestyle. Swimming, hiking, the recreational soccer league he played in on weekends, all of it potentially gone in a single moment of poor judgment. When will you know? He asked finally, his voice steadier than he expected. We've scheduled the surgery for tomorrow morning. We'll make the determination then based on what we find. Dr. Chen's expression softened slightly. Whatever happens, Mr. Thornton, there are excellent prosthetic options available today. Many amputees lead full active lives with minimal limitations. Jake nodded mechanically, not trusting himself to speak. After Dr. Chen left, an uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Mark cleared his throat. The police came by yesterday, he said, clearly trying to change the subject. They wanted to take a statement about the attack. Jake blinked. The police, why? Apparently there's some procedure they follow when there's a shark attack. They're working with Florida Fish and Wildlife to track the shark, try to determine if it's hanging around the beaches. Despite everything, Jake felt a flicker of alarm. They're not going to kill it, are they? It was just doing what sharks do. Mark looked surprised. I don't think so. Mostly they want to issue proper warnings, maybe close some beaches if necessary. He hesitated. They asked if you'd be willing to talk to them when you're feeling up to it. Sure, Jake said, though the idea of reliving the attack made his heart rate spike. The monitor beside his bed betrayed his reaction, and Diane quickly intervened. That's enough for now, she said firmly. Jake needs his rest before tomorrow. That night, alone in his hospital room, Jake drifted in and out of a fitful sleep, his dreams filled with dark water and gliding shadows. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, he gave up on sleep entirely and lay staring at the ceiling, trying to come to terms with what the next day might bring. He had always prided himself on his physical capabilities, on being strong, fast, coordinated. The thought of life without his left leg left him feeling hollow, as if he were already mourning, a part of himself. And yet a small voice in the back of his mind reminded him that it could have been worse, much worse. The shark could have taken an arm instead of a leg, could have severed the femoral artery completely, leaving him to bleed out before he ever reached the dock, could have been lurking in deeper water, where no one would have found him until it was too late. When dawn finally broke, painting his room with pale golden light, Jake had reached a sort of fragile acceptance. Whatever happened in surgery, he would adapt. He would survive. He had no other choice. The surgery lasted 6 hours. When Jake woke in the recovery room, groggy from anesthesia, he immediately tried to wiggle his toes, both sets. To his immense relief, he felt movement in both feet, though his left leg was heavily bandaged and elevated on a pillow. Dr. Chen visited him later that afternoon, her expression more optimistic than he'd seen it yet. "We were able to save the leg," she said without preamble. "It was touch and go, but the tissue was more viable than we initially thought." The wave of relief that washed over Jake was so intense, it left him lightheaded. "Thank you," he whispered. "What happens now?" "You're looking at a long recovery," Dr. Chen cautioned. "Multiple follow-up surgeries, extensive physical therapy, and I should warn you, while we saved the leg, there's significant nerve damage. You'll likely have permanent numbness and possibly chronic pain. There's also a high probability of a permanent limp." Jake nodded, still processing. "But I'll walk again without crutches or a cane?" "Eventually, yes, I believe so. Though it won't be easy and it won't be quick." It was enough. More than enough, given what he'd been facing just hours earlier. 2 days later, Jake was sitting up in bed, picking at a bland hospital lunch, when there was a knock at his door. A man and woman entered, both dressed in the khaki uniforms of the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. They introduced themselves as Officers Ramirez and Bennett. "We understand you were the victim of a shark attack in Emerald Bay 4 nights ago," Officer Ramirez said, pulling out a small notebook. "If you're feeling up to it, we'd like to ask you a few questions about the incident." Jake nodded, pushing away his tray. "I'll try, but it all happened pretty fast." For the next half hour, he recounted what he could remember of the attack, the time of night, the location, the size and appearance of the shark. The officers listened intently, occasionally making notes. "Based on your description and the bite pattern on your legs, we're quite certain it was a bull shark," Officer Bennett said when Jake had finished. "They're common in the Gulf this time of year, and they're one of the few species that regularly venture into shallow, brackish water." "Have there been other attacks?" Jake asked. "Not recently in this immediate area," Officer Ramirez replied, "but bull sharks are among the most aggressive shark species. They're territorial and can be provoked by unusual activity in their hunting grounds, like someone swimming at night." There was a faint note of reproof in her voice that made Jake wince. "I know it was stupid," he admitted. "There were advisories out, and my uncle warned me specifically about bull sharks in the bay." Officer Bennett's expression softened slightly. "Most shark attacks are cases of mistaken identity or territorial investigation, not predatory behavior. You were unlucky, but you also survived, which makes you luckier than some." Before leaving, Officer Ramirez handed Jake a form to fill out. "This is for our database of shark encounters. The information helps us track patterns and potentially prevent future incidents." Jake glanced over the form, simple enough, asking for details about the time, location, water conditions, and his own activities prior to the attack. "Will anything happen to the shark?" he asked as he began filling it out. "Unlikely," Officer Bennett said. "It's probably miles away by now. Sharks don't typically hang around areas after an encounter with humans. They're not interested in us as prey." "That's good," Jake said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. "It was just being a shark. I was the one in the wrong place at the wrong time." After the officers left, Jake sat with the shark encounter form, pen hovering over the signature line. It felt oddly anticlimactic. 4 days ago, he'd nearly died in a violent encounter with one of nature's most perfect predators. Now it was being reduced to data points on a government form, to be filed away and largely forgotten by everyone except him. He signed his name and set the form aside, then reached for his phone to check his social media. The story of his attack had made the local news briefly. "Local man injured in shark encounter," but had already been replaced by newer headlines. A couple of friends had texted asking if he was okay and offering to visit, but there were no messages from anyone who didn't already know him. In the grand scheme of things, his brush with death was just a blip, a minor curiosity in the daily news cycle. To the rest of the world, it was already over. To Jake, it was just beginning. The bull shark, meanwhile, continued its solitary journey through the Gulf of Mexico. For millions of years, its kind had roamed these waters perfect in their design, unchanged because they needed no improvement. They had survived the coming and going of countless species, including the strange, soft creatures that sometimes entered their domain. The shark felt no malice toward the human it had encountered, no satisfaction in the damage it had inflicted, no remorse for the pain it had caused. It simply was, existing in perfect harmony with its nature and its environment, neither good nor evil, but simply itself. As summer turned to fall, Jake Thornton began the long, arduous process of recovery. True to Dr. Chen's prediction, it wasn't easy. 3 more surgeries followed the initial ones, each designed to repair a different aspect of the damage to his left leg. Physical therapy was a special kind of torture, necessary but agonizing, pushing his body to limits he hadn't known existed. There were days when Jake wished they had taken the leg after all, days when the pain was so intense that even the strong prescription painkillers barely took the edge off. There were nights when he woke in a cold sweat, the sensation of teeth closing around his calf so vivid that he had to turn on the lights and physically touch his leg to reassure himself it was still there. Mark and Diane had insisted he stay with them during his recovery, converting their ground floor study into a bedroom so Jake wouldn't have to navigate stairs. His apartment in downtown Pensacola was a 3rd-floor walk-up. Manageable eventually, the doctors assured him, but not during the initial stages of his recovery. 6 weeks after the attack, Jake was sitting on the back porch of his uncle's house, his injured leg propped up on a cushioned ottoman. From this vantage point, he could see the dock where it had happened, the water beyond it sparkling innocently in the late September sunshine. "Penny, for your thoughts," Diane said. Emerging from the house with 2 glasses of iced tea, she handed one to Jake and settled into the chair beside him. Jake took a sip before answering. "I was just thinking about going back in," he said, nodding toward the water. Diane nearly choked on her tea. "You can't be serious." "Not right now, obviously," Jake clarified. "But eventually, when I'm healed enough." "Why on earth would you want to?" The genuine bewilderment in Diane's voice made Jake smile. "Because I'm not going to let one bad experience ruin something I've loved my whole life," he said simply. "I respect what happened. I'll be more careful, no night swimming, pay attention to advisories, but I'm not going to live in fear of the water." Diane shook her head, but there was a reluctant admiration in her eyes. "Your uncle is going to have a fit." "Probably," Jake agreed, "but it's something I need to do eventually. For myself." The truth was, he thought as Diane went back inside, his relationship with the ocean had changed irrevocably. He would never again wade into the water without an acute awareness of what lurked beneath the surface. But there was a difference between respect and fear, between caution and avoidance. The shark had taken enough from him already. Months of his life, possibly some permanent mobility, certainly his careless confidence. He wasn't going to let it take his love of the water too. 2 months after the attack, Jake returned to work at the architectural firm where he'd been employed for the past 6 years. His colleagues welcomed him back with a mixture of horror and fascination, everyone wanting to hear the story firsthand. Jake obliged, finding that each retelling made the experience seem more distant, more like something that had happened to someone else. "Did they ever catch the shark?" his co-worker Melissa asked during lunch on his first day back. Jake shook his head. "They don't really do that anymore. It's not like Jaws. Besides, how would they even know which one it was?" "Doesn't it freak you out?" another colleague chimed in. "So knowing it's still out there?" The question gave Jake pause. "Not really," he said after a moment. "It's not like it was personal. The shark wasn't targeting me specifically. It was just being a shark." As the months passed, Jake's physical recovery progressed better than the doctors had initially hoped. By December, he was walking with only a slight limp, though the numbness in his left foot remained. The scars were livid against his skin, a crescent of puncture marks on his right thigh, a more chaotic pattern of jagged lines on his left calf, where the flesh had been torn rather than cleanly bitten. Jake found himself oddly proud of these marks. They were proof of what he'd survived, a permanent reminder of how quickly life could change. He didn't hide them, even when he noticed people staring at the beach or the pool. The nightmares continued, though less frequently. In the worst ones, he was back in the water, but this time unable to reach the dock, the shark circling closer and closer, while Jake's strength ebbed away. He would wake from these dreams gasping, sheets soaked with sweat, the phantom pain in his legs temporarily convincing him that he was still being torn apart. On the anniversary of the attack, Jake stood once again on his uncle's dock, this time in the bright light of a July afternoon. The water was crowded with boats and jet skis, families enjoying the summer holiday weekend. No one looking at the cheerful scene would imagine that a near-fatal attack had happened here exactly 1 year. Mark emerged from the house and walked down to join him, a concerned frown creasing his forehead when he saw Jake's swimming trunks. "Are you sure about this?" he asked gruffly. "No one would think less of you if you stayed on dry land." Jake smiled. "I'm sure. I need to do this." He gestured to the brightly colored swim buoy attached to his waist. "I've got the shark deterrent, and I'm staying close to the dock. It'll be fine." The shark deterrent had been a gift from Diane, a device that emitted an electrical field designed to overwhelm a shark's sensitive electroreceptors, making it uncomfortable for them to approach. The science behind it was solid, but Jake knew it was more for his peace of mind than actual protection. The chances of encountering another shark, especially in the same location, were astronomically small. Mark didn't look convinced, but he nodded. "All right, but I'm staying right here watching." "Wouldn't have it any other way," Jake replied, then stepped to the edge of the dock. He stood there for a long moment, looking down at the greenish-blue water. His heart was racing, his palms sweaty. Memories of that night flashed through his mind. The sudden jerk sideways, the explosion of pain, the desperate scramble to escape. For a second, he nearly backed out. But then he thought of something. Dr. Chen had told him during one of his follow-up appointments, "The body remembers trauma. Sometimes the only way past that memory is to create new ones to replace it." Taking a deep breath, Jake dove in. The shock of the water closing over him brought a moment of panic, but it passed quickly. Jake surfaced, treading water as he oriented himself. The bay looked different in daylight, less mysterious, more benign. He could see all the way to the sandy bottom, no shadows lurking beneath. With deliberate strokes, Jake began to swim, staying parallel to the dock. His left leg was weaker than his right, making his usual smooth stroke slightly asymmetrical, but he could still move through the water with reasonable grace. The salt stung the still sensitive scar tissue on his legs, but it was a clean pain, almost purifying. He swam for perhaps 15 minutes, never venturing far from the dock before pulling himself up the ladder. Mark was waiting with a towel and an expression of barely concealed relief. "How was it?" he asked. Jake considered the question as he dried off. "Different," he said finally, "but good, like reclaiming something." That night, Jake dreamed of the ocean again, but this time there was no attack, no desperate struggle for survival. Instead, he was swimming freely, the water clear and warm around him. And though he knew even in the dream that he wasn't alone in that vast blue expanse, that there were countless creatures sharing the sea with him, some beautiful, some dangerous, he felt no fear, only a profound sense of acceptance. Somewhere, far out in the Gulf of Mexico, the bull shark that had attacked Jake continued its ancient patterns of migration, following the rhythms of feeding and breeding that had guided its species for millennia. It had no concept of the impact it had had on one human life, no awareness of the pain it had caused or the changes it had wrought. Neither villain nor monster, simply a perfect predator acting according to its nature, the shark swam on through the endless blue, indifferent to the mark it had left on Jake Thornton's body and soul. A mark that he would carry with him always, both as a wound and as a strange gift, the knowledge of his own fragility and his own strength, and the thin, invisible line that separates the world of humans from the wild that still exists all around them.